Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second political science discussion event of the spring 2025 semester. Dr. Lawrence, and I'll be introducing our panelists and introducing our topic in just a moment. Before we do get started, I do want to let you know this is a virtual panel discussion that's hosted by the Department of History and Political Science and the School of Arts and Letters here at Middle Georgia State, along with the Middle Georgia State University Political Science Student Organization and the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science students. So before we get started, I do want to briefly introduce what the political science program at Middle Georgia State does. Well, I try to get the lights on here. Here we go. We do offer several different programs, including the Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science, Bachelor of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies, as well as minors in Political Science, African Diaspora Studies, Environmental Policy Studies, Local Government Administration, Global Studies, and Pre-Law, as well as the Certificate in European Union Studies. So if any of those things might sound interesting to you, you might want to talk to your advisor about them. Before we get too much further, I do want to introduce our panelists for today. First, in alphabetical order, we have I guess I'll go by last name. We have our colleague, Dr. Matthew Catterley, who's an assistant professor of public safety, who's been here at Middle Georgia State since 2016 as a lecturer and now an assistant professor. His doctorate in political science is from the University of Florida, and it looks like he's here, and I'm seeing his picture. He might just be, might not have his camera on yet, but hopefully he'll be joining us on video as well. Also, we have Dr. John Hall, who's an associate professor of political science and has been here at Middle Georgia State since 2015. His doctorate is in public policy and administration from Auburn University. And I'll be your humble moderator today. As I said, I'm Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm a professor of political science, been here at Middle Georgia State since 2012, and have a doctorate in political science from the University of Mississippi. As far as our discussion today goes, I want to tell you a little bit about our structure and some of the topics we've potentially planned to discuss. The panelists and I have talked over a few topics and drafted a few potential questions that we'll be asking, but we also want your questions as well, or if you have follow-up questions, we're interested in seeing those too. And we will be accepting those via the chat window. So if you click on chat, you should be able to post in there. So a couple of ground rules for the chat. First, while you're more than welcome to ask more than one question if you wish, we do want to prioritize answering at least one question per person. So everybody has an opportunity to ask questions and get their questions answered. Of course, if we don't get that many questions, then we're happy to allow you to ask multiple questions as well. But like I said, I do expect that we'll try to prioritize at least one per person to make sure that we're spreading the wealth. We do ask you to be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window. As you know, there are lots of expectations from members of our Middle Georgia State University community, and hopefully you will uphold those in the chat. And hopefully that will be the last I need to say about that. As far as our discussion topics are concerned, so here are a few of the topics that we may discuss in addition to your potential questions. There's a potential, keep using the word potential a lot, government shutdown looming on Friday. So we're going to talk a little about that. The government restructuring effort, known, I believe, as DOGE, I believe is how you're supposed to pronounce that, to the extent you're supposed to pronounce it. We'll talk about that. Tariffs was a topic in our last conversation, but since it's kind of a domestic and foreign policy issue, it's coming up again. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, perhaps. Some potential Supreme Court decisions that we think are likely to come up, be decided in the next month or so. And then immigration policy, and particularly a case that's emerged in the last few days or so out of Columbia University involving uh, a recent graduate of Columbia University, Mahmoud Khalil. I'm sure I'm butchering his name. I apologize for that in advance. So we're going to potentially talk about that as well. So, without too much further ado, we will go ahead and get started with our first question. So I hit the stop presenting button so you can see our faces in bigger glory. There's Dr. Caverly. So our first question deals with the potential government shutdown, possible government shutdown. So a government shutdown is potentially looming on Friday if Congress is unable to pass a bill that extends the current budget using what is known as a continuing resolution. So I guess the first part of that might be, what is a continuing resolution? I think I kind of explained that in the question, but we can elaborate on that. And then how likely is it that Congress will be able to extend that funding by the deadline to get that done and avoid a shutdown? So I see Dr. Hall is unmuted, so perhaps he'll want to get started with that one.
Excellent. Yes, I'll jump on this. Again, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matt, for being here. I'd like to thank all of our colleagues and all of our students who have taken time out of their schedule to join us on this extraordinarily important policy discussion on domestic issues regarding the potential shutdown. Before we get to that, we need to identify a couple of variables that we have and will continue to discuss in American government classes, and that is congressional power over the purse, which we have obviously discussed in American government. Congress has certain responsibilities regarding the budget. And after legislation like the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 and the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, Congress is in a position where the president will submit a budget proposal that Congress has to approve. Now, in order to do so, there are specifically 12 appropriations budgets that include things like transportation, agriculture, defense. Technically, there's 24 because the House and the Senate both deal with them. These 12 appropriation budgets have to be approved and then signed off by the president like any other law. However, Congress, this may come as a surprise to some, doesn't necessarily have a great deal of success agreeing with itself and getting complex legislation like a budget passed. So when they can't pass an actual budget, what they'll do is use something called a continuing resolution. Now, a continuing resolution, as the name suggests, it says it in its name, continuing resolution. What it does, it allows us to continue to fund the government, the federal government, or at least parts of it, at pre-existing levels. So when Congress can't agree with itself on a formal budget before the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st, they will use this stopgap to continue funding the federal government through the use of continuing resolutions. So that's a general breakdown of continuing resolutions. They're basically the federal government or Congress funding the government when they cannot successfully pass an actual budget. It's kind of piecemeal. Having said that, the current continuing resolution that has just been recently passed by the House of Representatives was passed on a very small majority. It was like 217 to 213. There was only one Republican in the House who did not vote for it, a Republican from Kentucky by the name of Massey. There was actually one Democrat who voted for it in the House. The Republicans have successfully passed their continuing resolution, this temporary continuation of federal government spending through the end of September through the House. Now they have to get it through the Senate. As we have discussed in class, legislation has to go through the House and the Senate. The problem in the Senate, as we again have discussed in several classes, is the fact that they have access to the filibuster. So while the Republicans have a 53 to 47 lead in the Senate, they have one Republican, Senator Rand Paul, who said he is not voting for this. They basically need 8 Democrats to support them because in order to end a filibuster, you need a 60-vote supermajority in the Senate. So while having passed their continuing resolution to continue funding the federal government in the House, Republicans now need to get it to the Senate, and in order to do so, they need 8 Democrats to join them. That actually might happen. The 8 senators of Democratic persuasion might actually be there to support the Republicans. And we know this because the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, did not say that the Democrats would try to block it in the Senate. And in political speak, the fact that he did not say that Democrats are going to try to stop it means that he knows that he may not have the votes to do that. There are also some Democrats in the Senate who have already said that they will support it. Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, Senator Angus King, who is an independent, though they caucus with the Democrats from Maine, also might support it. So what we're looking at, to summarize all of this before I get lost in budget hell here, the Republicans have successfully passed their continuing resolution through the Republican-controlled House, and now they need to get it through the Republican-controlled Senate. But again, they have 53 Republicans in the Senate, not 60. They will need Democratic support. With that being said, we can look at a couple of the items within the Republican continuing resolution. And keep in mind, this is very normal. In the last almost 50 years and almost a half a century, Congress has had a full budget passed before the due date 3 times. So continuing resolutions are kind of how Congress operates. And when we're looking at the budget, it's important to note that almost 2/3 of the federal budget comes in the form of mandatory spending, things like Social Security, things like Medicare, and of course, payment on interest on our debt. The actual federal budget that Congress is really debating year in and year out only constitutes about 1/3 of all federal spending, which we call discretionary spending. And in this current continuing resolution, the Republicans have put forth a temporary budget that would, again, maintain existing spending levels. They do plan on spending a little bit more, about $13 billion extra on defense. And there are several $billion that will be removed from certain healthcare and social safety net programs. But again, that's where we are now. The Republicans have passed their continuing resolution to the House. They now have to get it to the Senate. And if they don't do so, by Friday at midnight, the federal government shuts down. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean the entire federal government. There are certain positions that are considered too important to be furloughed, if you will. But that's where we are. Now, in terms of opinions, I think that was part of this. How likely is it that Congress will be able to agree? Generally speaking, I would bet money that Congress will probably get this passed. Whatever minority party is responsible or held responsible by the American people for shutting down the government, they generally don't do well politically. So the Democratic Party knows they have something of a fiscal gun at their head. While they don't like the Republican continuing resolution, they don't like the Republican budget, they were completely left out of its negotiation. They're not stupid. At least I don't think they are. And they will realize that they will be blamed if the federal government shuts down. On that note, I realize I have been speaking for way too long, but this was a really hard subject to quickly summarize. So I'm going to end right there. And my final prediction is yes, I think the federal government will somehow continue to be funded after Friday. I'll turn over the rest to Matt to fill in all the blanks.
Well, I don't think there's too many blanks to fill in, but well, one thing I would try to answer the question: why are continuing resolutions the norm now for Congress? And well, they're the norm because of the persistence of partisan gridlock. And while we don't have divided government right now, there are also a feeding measure of that the dominant form of government since 1969 has been divided, which means that the presidency was under the control of one party, and one or more or both branches of Congress were under the control of the other party. In fact, we just left a time of that. But those two together are really the idea of the governing by continuing resolutions. You could add a third one, which is this, which John alluded to, which is that the vast majority, the ability to have budgetary discretion has shrunk considerably in over the recent decades, because as entitlements have grown, as interest on the national debt has grown, and as there has been effectively the usage of the employment of the Pentagon, which is normally upwards of half of the discretionary budget, is treated as if it's a sacrosanct entity. That means that what's left isn't much to play around with, and so the real limitation on what the congressman and what the administration can do regarding those uh, regarding what's left. I mean, normally what you're talking about when it's left, John mentioned a third, but he was including the Pentagon in there. If you pull the Pentagon out, you're talking about very often less than 20% of the budget in any given year. And so there isn't a whole lot to play around with there. And the the thing, by the way, I will say this too, that just by way of also maybe to add in a little bit here, um, the word a resolution. Resolution means the sense of the Congress, and when there's two types of resolutions, there's a joint resolution and there's a simple resolution. A simple resolution is chamber specific, and it's an example of lawmaking that's not a law. It's a symbolic gesture. But a joint resolution, which means it's passed both the House and the Senate, has the force of law. So, in other words, it's a bill by any other name. And so the appropriations bills and so on and so forth, the budget resolution and stuff like that is really it's a law by any other name. But that's why the term resolution comes from. So anyway, I hope that addressed that question about continuing resolutions and maybe also add what a resolution actually is. I'll say one final thing about the budget. The budgetary period for the United States, the federal budget year, the fiscal year begins on October 1st of one year and ends on September 30th of the next year. And so what we're talking about these appropriations bills, again, we go back to what are different kinds of legislation. There Another way of categorizing legislation is, does it involve money or does it involve policy? Policy-based resolutions are policy-based laws are authorizations. We're going to do this. We're going to build some post offices. And appropriations are, here's how we're going to pay for it. So if we got to build post office, we're going to have to pay for it. So the budget is built off of the combination of those, but what becomes important is the appropriations part, because that's where the money is. And as John alluded to, the Constitution is very clear about budgetary power. It ultimately lies with the Congress, and it actually must begin in the House of Representatives. But this has been modified over time and so on. A lot of it's been delegated to the president. He already went through all that. So, but anyway, I just wanted to add in there. Hopefully that gives a little bit of some clarification about some things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt and John. We did have kind of a follow-up question, which is kind of why I don't think either of you directly addressed this question. Why are continuing resolutions the norm now for Congress? I think pretty straightforwardly, we can just say that, long story short, as I believe Dr. Hall said in his answer, Congress has rarely been able to pass all the appropriations bills that it needs to pass in time for the new fiscal year, which starts in October. And so what happens essentially is that anything else that isn't taken care of was taken care of by a continuing resolution. Now, for the longest time, Congress was able to pass most of the bills, and so continuing resolutions would only take care of, two or three programs or something like that. But increasingly, Congress has been unable to agree on many, if any, of the actual spending bills in time, and so these continuing resolutions have become kind of a standard practice, in large part because, well, for a couple of reasons. First, I would say that there's less bipartisanship than was in the past in Congress. And within the parties, it's hard to get full agreement on spending bills, in particular, because um, you know uh, they have different factions within the party have different priorities. I guess probably the simplest way to put it. We can elaborate on that more if you want to, but so that's essentially why that's the case. As far as their frequency, it's been a while since we had a full government shutdown. We were close to having one in the last year or so, but that was averted pretty much the last minute. Um, so it's been several years since we had a government shutdown that actually lasted more than a couple of hours. But the one thing I would add is that we do have some news that's come out today where the Democrats, now, of course, this could be negotiating, although who you're negotiating with at this point is kind of hard to tell because the House apparently is already adjourned and is not going to be negotiating unless somebody forces them to come back and do it. But apparently the Democrats had a lunch meeting today, and are coming out saying hardball, essentially. Senator Kane from Virginia says there are not the votes right now to pass a continuing resolution. I guess the other elephant in the room here is that, although there's been no discussion of this, and I don't know what the appetite for this among Republicans would be, but there is always the so-called nuclear option, which for those of you that don't know, the nuclear option is essentially where the Senate just says, basically, well, we're getting rid of the filibuster. They've done it before for other things, and so it's possible that if there's a majority vote in the Senate to basically say we're not going to allow filibusters on continuing resolutions or budget resolutions or anything, then theoretically, at least, that's something they could do, as they have abolished the filibuster for other things like presidential nominations and things like that already. So it is possible that Congress could do something, or the Senate could do something to essentially eliminate the need for the Democrats to agree. I don't know what the appetite for that is. Haven't heard a lot of speculation that there's much appetite for that. I think a lot of Republicans might actually prefer to have the Democrats own a government shutdown as opposed to getting rid of the filibuster for that. But then again, maybe they did. It really kind of depends to some extent on a lot of, how much President Trump, wants them to actually keep the government quote unquote open. Although, as we'll see in a moment, the government is a lot of the government's closed anyway, or closing. So how much the administration wants to, keep the government open is also a little bit up for debate as well, which I think will segue us nicely into our next question. So one of the early actions by the Trump administration, and actually on the campaign trail, President Trump taught a lot about this idea, to some, at least on occasion, was to repurpose part of the Office of Management budget, and implement something called, that was referred to as the Department of Government Efficiency. By the way, just one one important point here is this is not a real department under the it's not a cabinet department. It's not a official. I mean, it's an official agency, but it's using the word department in a way that is annoying to political scientists because it makes it hard for us to teach about the cabinet and the government, because things that are not departments shouldn't be called departments. But anyway, nonetheless, and of course, this is one of those acronyms that was obviously designed to spell the word that it is abbreviated as, which is DOGE, which I'm told is pronounced Doge by the hipper people that I know, which is some sort of internet meme. I don't really understand. And this agency may or may not be headed by Elon Musk. We're not really sure. The administration has said various things to various people, depending on whether or not they're under oath at the time. So what has this Doge thing been doing? And how successful has it been in pursuing those goals so far? Dr. Cavalier, do you want to lead off on that one?
Well, I'll give it a shot. Doge. So Doge was originally proposed as a voluntary extra governmental, meaning outside governmental agency who would be tasked for the first year and a half of the second Trump administration to develop a body of cuts in the federal government to ferret out waste, to expose corruption, to reduce the size of the state, to eliminate the presence of an embedded deep state bureaucracy that was operating contrary to American values, and so that was the original pitch. But when and it was going to be headed, if you will, by Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. But when President Trump actually became president again, the Doge was altered. Doge became a part of the White House staff. And of course, part of that was Ramaswamy left before that even occurred because he made the movement. He has a plan to run for political office in his home state of Ohio. And so that left Musk. And so the Mr. Musk is ostensibly in charge of it. What Dr. Lawrence is referring to is that there's some question as to whether does Musk really run it, or is Musk just sort of the public face of it, and a kind of kitchen cabinet type advisor to President Trump and so on and so forth. So we don't really know, and this brings in lots of accountability issues. But what it has become since it's become a part of the White House has actually been somewhat of a clearinghouse for the president's agenda, at least regarding shrinking the size of the domestic state. So it's went after various government agencies to utilizing certain discretionary powers that exist within the ability of the president to organize and reorganize the executive branch. They utilize powers to lay a bunch of people off. Mostly, what they did is they laid off probationary workers who don't have the same degree of civil service guarantees on their tenures. And of course, they called for voluntary retirements, or I guess you could say voluntold retirements, and that sort of thing. And that's had some happen. And probably their biggest thing right now is working along with to help fulfill President Trump's campaign agenda, which was when President Trump ran for office, he said, I'm going to shut down the Department of Education. And so he's apparently utilizing Doge to begin that process of shutting down that department. Now, that in itself is going to cause some conflicts because cabinet level departments actually established by acts of Congress. So this is going to cause a fight. How much discretionary authority does the president really have to control? Can the president shut down something that was established by Congress? And so what would this mean if he can? This could open the door to all kinds of reorganization techniques, both of the current president and perhaps future presidents. But there's going to be a fight over that. So a lot of this really comes down to is how much power does Doge really have? It's kind of with Professor Lawrence's notion about it's not really a department. That is true, is not. If it was named correctly, and it would probably be called an office if it was named correctly, because it's a part of the It's a part of what's known as the White House office, the White House, which is the official name of called the WHO. It's the official name of the White House staff. But that in itself is a change. Remember, it wasn't really proposed that that's what it was actually going to be. And so that's an interesting thing. There's also some stuff that's causing some conflicts because um, um, Doge has said, or previously President Trump said, well, we're not going to do anything with entitlements. We're not going to do anything with defense spending. Um, so again, that goes back to the previous topic about the limitation of the discretionary budget. But Doge has actually went right into and has actually said, well, we're gonna go after the Pentagon, and we're looking at a 5 to 8% employee cut of a civilian workforce, and that's that's already caused a little conflict with Secretary Hegseth, who said, "Oh, wait a minute, this is my department, not yours," and so on and so forth. He's also had there's been some pushback within the Department of State, apparently from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, um, who has a kind of political gravitas in the Republican Party that a lot of President Trump's cabinet secretaries do not. And he definitely has a support base in the Congress that a lot of a lot of the other secretaries do not. But nonetheless, this is a matter of fight. It's an interesting thing. Now, I will say this: uh, President Trump is not the first president to ever utilize a reorganization scheme as a part of his political agenda. I mean, this goes way back. Jimmy Carter built his office. Ronald Reagan did a lot in that area. Lyndon Johnson and Jack Kennedy did a bunch. So did FDR. So in that sense, it's not historic, but in the magnitude, if you will, I would argue there is some historical activity going on right now, because a lot of power has been assumed in a very short period of time, and we will see over time what this really means and how this goes along. But I'm sure that Professor Hall has more important things to say on this than I ever will.
No, you nailed that. Thank you, Chris and Matt. Again, I love the clarity that y'all brought to the students and everyone listening, that DOGE is not a formal department. It actually was created by an executive order by President Trump. As we know, and as y'all have said, and as we cover in class, Congress is responsible for creating every cabinet level department, all 15, every independent regulatory agency, everything, NASA, the Securities and Exchange Commission, every agency, department in the executive branch is created by Congress. And then presidents have executive order powers to create things like DOGE. Again, what DOGE is doing, and y'all done a great job, we can break it down to this. The Republican Party for generations has been the party of, well, nominally the party that claims they want smaller government. They don't think the government's efficient. They don't really necessarily like the government. Now, if you are receiving services from the federal government, there are services that you would find to be very advantageous that others might not. We have roughly a $36 trillion deficit, and the Trump administration is nominally claiming that they want to go after that. So that's what they're doing. And they are slashing and burning. Dr. Cavalier is correct. This is not the first reorganization. This is not the first time an administration tried to aggressively reduce the federal government's power and its cost. What is somewhat controversial is, again, the quasi-government / citizen relationship that Elon Musk has here, the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight. That's really what's driving a lot of the controversy. It's important to note that DOGE has been quite successful in terms of slashing and burning through government programs. The first and foremost is U.S. aid, or AID, the Agency for International Development. This is over $30 billion a year that the U.S. spends helping people around the world. A lot of this, it takes the form of feeding people who are hungry, helping with healthcare in poverty-stricken nations. Now, you will find on a line item basis that there are some projects that any government agency will be involved with that you might not think are valuable, and that's a major target. Another controversial element of DOGE and its slashing and burning is the misinformation. They have been guilty. It has been shown that they have said things that the government's doing that they're not doing. They have said They have achieved savings that they have then backed away from. So when it comes down to it, if you have faith that the federal government is an engine for good and that can be a powerful mechanism for progress, you want it to be able to do things. If you look at the federal government and think it's just a big, wasteful, power-hungry, bureaucratic entity, you want to reduce that power. And you tend to divide Democrats and Republicans along those lines. The success so far, again, of DOGE in terms of slashing and burning has taken the form of a lot of layoffs. A lot of people that Matt's already discussed this. There are certain entities that the Trump administration, as all the administrations have said, they will not touch. And that would be Social Security and Medicare. Those are the big ones. Those are two of the biggest entitlement programs. And they're usually referred to as the third rail in American politics. If you touch them, your career is over. But while not necessarily attacking yet Social Security or Medicare, the Trump administration has been able to start firing a lot of people at the Social Security Administration. So that can start to really impede the government's efficiency. A lot of cuts that have occurred, things like they want to cut over half of the IRS from about 90,000 down to about 45,000. DOGE is an aggressive, non-congressionally created entity that is slashing and burning through the federal government, only being slowed by the federal court that has issued injunctions on several of their attempts at destroying federal government organizations. Again, major controversy here, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is, again, Congress has the power of the purse. When Congress appropriates money to be spent by the executive branch, if the executive branch unilaterally decides not to spend that money, that represents a major problem with separation of powers. It was actually the Nixon administration's refusal to spend money appropriated by Congress that led to the Congressional Budget Act in '74 to begin with. So major constitutional controversies that are going on here would be simply summarized by the executive branch is getting overwhelmingly involved in legislative branch power of the purse. Also, there's some conflicts of interest with Elon Musk at the head of this. He has major organizations that have billions of dollars in government contracts, and he is nominally in charge of cutting government contracts. So there's a degree of conflict of interest. And also one other major 800-pound gorilla and or bear in the room involves the overall point of DOGE, according to the Trump administration, is to cut spending, to cut the debt, to cut deficits. But the money that we are saving from everything that has been cut or anything that will be cut in the future, unless they hit Social Security, pales in comparison to the money that we are no longer bringing in as a direct result of 2017 tax cuts. There are upwards of $3.5 to $4 trillion that we are missing in the federal treasury from massive tax cuts by the first Trump administration. So many critics of DOGE are looking at it thinking, if you want to save money, simply remove those tax cuts, many of which predominantly went to the wealthy and to corporations, where corporate income taxes went from 35% down to 21%. Many critics would say, if you want to save money, you're doing it the wrong way. Bring back the revenue that we've lost from massive tax cuts from the first Trump administration. All of this, kind of to summarize it, these are interesting times in which we live.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to what Dr. Hall said there was about the tax cuts in particular, right? In fact, a lot of the tax cuts that were put in place under the first Trump administration, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, are actually scheduled to expire this year, right? And so Congress is going to be in the position of not only having to vote to extend those tax cuts, but also figure out some way to offset them with less government spending in the future, right? And how much of that really can't, as Dr. Hall and Dr. Kaplan have suggested, how much of that really can be cut without going after the sacred cows, right? Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, that sort of thing, right? And even when you're fiddling the margins of something like Social Security, right? The issue of cutting back on the number of people that are working at the Social Security Administration that are answering phones and things like that, right? People can't collect their Social Security benefits even if they're still nominally entitled to them, are they going to be upset, if they can't get them, even if, they haven't been repealed or whatever, right? My suspicion is that, when you talk about a third rail, right, it's not so much, the dollar amount being cut, although certainly that would be a big issue, but, if grandma or ma or, your, disabled relative or whoever can't get their Social Security, because they can't get anybody on the phone to help them, or their website's busted or whatever, right? I think that would be a real kind of political problem for the administration going into, the midterms coming up. So we have a couple questions in the chat having to do with uh, first one, kind of what kind of backlash can we expect if something like the Department of Education shutdown actually happened? Um, I mean, I think the short answer is it really depends on what form that takes. I mean, we haven't always had a Department of Education. The question is, would those programs still be continued under other departments, right? I mean, before the Department of Education, there was a Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, I believe it was called back in the 70s. I can't remember exactly when Department of Education. I don't know if that was Carter or Ford or Nixon. But before that, we had HEW, which administered basically the same programs. So, and that's one thing you have to bear in mind is, just because something's called something doesn't necessarily mean that that's everything under that department is going to be administered or not administered, right? I mean, those of us that are old enough to remember, for example, know that, back just after the 9/11 attacks, about some years ago now, right? We essentially reorganized, had the biggest reorganization of the federal government since the Roosevelt administration, and created the Department of Homeland Security. Did we get rid of any programs as part of that? No, we just a lot of them just got either renamed or moved into other departments or rearranged. A lot of people would argue that Homeland Security didn't actually get big enough in some ways because things that probably have a lot to do with Homeland Security still ended up not being moved. Like the department, like a lot of law enforcement stayed outside of Homeland Security, for example. So um, a few programs got renamed, right? We had the INS, and now we have Customs and Border Patrol, and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, the programs didn't go away. Just the titles of the people running it changed, right? Or the exact reporting lines changed. So the part of the question is, are the programs going to go away, or is this just sort of, you know, literally with the case of USAID, right? Are you just chipping the name off the building and, not really accomplishing anything other than some optics, right? My suspicion is that there are people in the administration and certainly people like Elon Musk that would love to make all the programs go away too, but politically, again, is it the third rail of American politics to get rid of, say, school lunches or student loans and Pell Grants and things like that? I'm not sure it's the third rail, but it's you're getting close to the third rail, right? Anytime you're taking away stuff from people, um, that can be issues, right? A lot of it's not just poor people that depend on things like uh, direct loans and things like that to send their kids to college, right? Uh, so, um, uh, let's see. And kind of related that also, I have a question about how does cutting USA with its far-reaching programs deteriorate U.S.-African relations? I don't know if it wants to tackle that one. We do have another question about immigration and trade, but we're actually going to talk about immigration and trade later, so we'll defer that. But we do have a question about USA,
That
which
that's
Dr.
a
Hall brought up. So
that's a great question. It really depends again on your philosophy regarding not just the federal government, but the United States and our place in the world. If you want the United States to be a global leader, to exercise economic, military, and soft power, then you want U.S. aid. You simply do. It's the largest aid, or it's the largest aid program in the world, and everywhere U.S. aid money would have been spent around the world when we remove it, I assure you, China will come in and fill in that vacuum. So if you want the United States to have an impact on global politics, you want U.S. aid. Not to mention just the good, I have good feelings in my head. If you want the planet Earth to look at the United States and think that is a power for good, you want U.S. aid. And you also have to keep in mind, and this again goes back to one of the controversies. If you're trying to reduce the debt, if you're trying to reduce deficit spending, there is an exponentially larger amount of revenue out there in the form of not renewing the tax cuts. I'm not saying I'm for them or against them. I'm pointing out the math. It's as if we are dealing with a bucket of water and we're looking at drops over here compared to an entire gallon over here. So effectively reducing government spending and reducing the debt, you can do that by reducing government tax cuts, predominantly, again, to wealthy individuals and corporations. With that being said, U.S. aid, while being the largest aid organization in the world, it's not that big compared to the U.S. budget. This is another problem when it comes to U.S. electoral politics. Americans, again, this is not in any offensive way, Americans have a relatively low level of political knowledge when compared to other liberal democracies. We don't know a lot about the government. When polled, the average, roughly almost half of Americans, when asked how much of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid, you will get upwards of half of Americans who respond, like 40%. About half of Americans think we spend almost half of the federal budget on foreign aid, when in fact, it's less than 1%. So most Americans really don't quite get how little, as it relates to our overall budget, we actually spend on foreign aid. So they seem to think and have negative thoughts toward aid because they think we spend more than we do. Interestingly enough, the Americans who think incorrectly that we spend 40 or 50% of the federal budget on foreign aid, when asked what do they think the ideal amount would be, they say 10%. Americans actually want us to spend 10%, 10 times more than we actually do. So again, U.S. aid, there's a lot going on with the question, what do we want to do with it? If you want America to be a power on the global stage and to be viewed as a power for good, you want organizations like U.S. aid. If you do not care about America's role in geopolitics around the world, then maybe you don't necessarily care about U.S. aid.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is, in political science, we talk a lot about hard power and soft power, right? And soft power, things like U.S. aid, foreign assistance, that sort of thing are a big part of soft power, right? Where you're not using military force, not using, saber rattling, that's a big part of how the United States has been able to exert its influence on the world stage the last, century, right? Particularly since World War II. And I don't want to belabor this too much because we talked about this last month. And if you want to hear about us talking about this last month, of course, you can go and watch our me and John and Dr. Matchrock talking about it last month. Because I think at the time, I think one of the things I said in that discussion was that as Dr. Hall correctly pointed out, right, that this is the best thing we could do for China's Belt and Road Initiative, because the Chinese weren't getting very far with it. In fact, they managed to take everybody off, basically, that was involved in Belt and Road, and then suddenly we're just kind of, okay, well, go back to the Chinese again because you ain't getting anything from us, right? Again, if you're an isolationist, if you don't believe in, if you want to retrench, if you want to, maintain power on the the Western Hemisphere or whatever and ignore the rest of the world, maybe that works, but then again, I don't know how you reconcile that with a foreign policy that also was aggressively expansionist, right? It's talking about, hey, we need to annex Greenland. We need to, make Canada the 51st state. We need to retake the Panama Canal. What is your actual foreign policy goal here? I'm not sure there is one sometimes. But anyway, no, we don't want to get too bogged down in foreign policy because this isn't a foreign policy discussion. But we do have a question kind of related to foreign policy to some extent. That is, we talked a little bit last time about tariffs, but there have been some developments. We've had some tariffs implemented and then revised and suspended and then reimposed. And I think somebody yesterday joked this is the first time they'd ever seen a graph of tariff rates that changed within a day. Because literally we had 50% tariffs on Canada for about half an hour or something like that. And then they went away again. Oh, you just have to laugh at this point. So, the president has threatened, implemented, some cases reversed, suspended various tariffs against foreign countries, particularly Canada and Mexico, also China. Talked about doing them with the European Union as well. So, first question is, what's a tariff, right? Well, sometimes, again, getting back to basic definitions, what are we talking about? We're talking about a tariff. And what is the current status of those tariffs, and what is the administration trying to accomplish with these tariffs? Is it just I don't like foreign trade, or is there actually something beyond that, motivating the tariff policy? Because honestly, I'm at a loss to figure it out sometimes. Maybe you can help me. I don't know if you can, but maybe.
I don't know. It's my turn to go. I'll jump in.
Yeah, I think Dr.
Great question. What is a tariff? And again, for anyone out there, and again, we're seeing in public opinion polls today that many Americans do not know what tariffs actually do. Tariffs are quite simply taxes charged on goods imported from other countries. Simple as that. Tariffs have been around since the dawn of civilization. Tariffs have been used for millennia. However, in our modern age, in our post-World War II era, especially our post-Cold War era, in a global system literally created by the United States of America and her allies, other liberal democracies that are also market-based economies, tariffs have been viewed as the single worst thing you can possibly do. Historically, tariffs were used to protect domestic industry from foreign industry that could be imported cheaper. So if you want to protect young industry, tariffs are a good idea. Hence, we used them very early on. We have emerged in a post-Cold War era, actually dating all the way back to the end of World War II with the Bretton Woods conferences, where the United States and our allies have created a global system with lower trade barriers, a more integrated global economy. We live in a globalized world. The world is much, much smaller, and tariffs for generations have been a thing of the past. Small tariffs have always existed, but aggressively using tariffs, that's something that the industrialized liberal democratic world has long since given up on, for the most part. It's also important to note who pays for tariffs. And this is important because many Americans do not know, and we'll talk more about President Trump himself on this in a moment. Tariffs are paid for by Americans. If you have this conception that a 20% tariff on goods from China to the United States, that you think Beijing is paying that 20%, that's incorrect. All material, all goods coming into China will simply cost 20% more to Americans. Those people who are bringing those goods in will have to pay that tax to the federal treasury, and then they pass on that higher cost to consumers. So if you put a 20% tariff on all goods coming in from China, all of those goods are going to cost you 20% more. 25% tariffs on Mexico, Canada, all those goods are going to cost 25% more. If you have a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imported to the U.S., all of that steel and that aluminum is going to cost 25% more. So you might wonder, why use tariffs? Great question. Again, back to what Dr. Lawrence was saying, I'm at a loss for what the administration is doing. In terms of why the administration is using them, I think there are a couple of variables that we can jump into. First and foremost, President Trump likes tariffs. You can see this in his rhetoric in the first and in his second administration. He looks at tariffs as a way to punish other countries that have evolved to a point where they've developed a positive for them trade deficit, a negative for us trade deficit. It's an overly simplistic way of looking at macroeconomic realities in a globalized world. Tariffs, he's a big fan of them. I think he just likes them. He believes that countries are ripping us off, which for the most part, they're not. But he wants to punish them. He wants to make other countries pay, which they're not doing. Americans will be paying for it. He also likes the fact that within reason, due to legislation almost a century old, the president can increase tariffs without congressional approval. He doesn't have to go through that. He can unilaterally do what he is doing. But again, in terms of what the administration is trying to do here, I don't know. Again, and this is absolutely nothing against President Trump on a personal level or on a professional level. But when it comes to President Trump and tariffs, the question has to be asked, does he himself know exactly how tariffs operate? And I only say that because on several occasions, when asked by reporters about American goods increasing at the exact same rate as tariffs increase, the price of goods that we pay for from other nation states will increase because we pay the tariffs. Taxpayers wind up paying the tariff, or consumers pay these tariffs. He actually looked at the reporter on multiple occasions and said, that is a lie. That is false news. That is fake news. President Trump on multiple occasions has said foreign nations pay for tariffs. Now, this could either be a political act. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings here, but elected politicians have been known to stretch the truth occasionally, Democrats and Republicans. So either this is a political ploy to say, no, foreign governments are paying the tariffs, which they're not. The second option I look at is unimaginable, and that would be that he doesn't know. I cannot accept that as a possibility. But again, why are we aggressively imposing tariffs in this draconian manner? Why are we launching this completely voluntary unilateral trade war with our closest allies and the rest of the world? I don't know. I do know this, that not only the tariffs, but the schizophrenic way in which some of them have been deployed, saying, we'll have a tariff on Canada today, but then taking it back a little bit later. This has not made the markets happy. If you look at just over the last month with the aggressive tariffs starting to go into effect, the S&P 500 is down 7%. That's not the S&P 500 is down 7 points. It's down 7%. The Dow is down 7%. The NASDAQ is down 10%. The market is not happy with the deployment of these tariffs. So that's another possible negative. The Trump administration itself has refused to say that these actions won't possibly cause a recession. And then you could also get the strange late 1970s stagflation of possible high costs, high unemployment, and high inflation at the end of all of this. So again, aggressive tariff policies are controversial because the United States and the rest of the industrialized world has abandoned them long ago. A few other quick characteristics here before we run out of time, if I haven't already. Other problems with tariffs is that they don't make intuitive sense. For example, if you are using a tariff to pressure another country to do something, if they acquiesce and actually do it, then you have to take the tariff away. So the tariff, by definition, when used as a manner of controlling other nations, won't be permanent. Also, if tariffs are meant to promote U.S. domestic industry, there's some problems there. I don't know who would be there to hold all of these new jobs. We have some of the lowest unemployment in American history. Also, if tariffs are meant to promote U.S. domestic industry, let's say they work. Let's say a whole lot of different industries that have gone overseas come back to the States. Eventually, you can then no longer use tariffs as a revenue source. If you successfully use tariffs to invigorate domestic industries, once we start buying American, I don't think that would happen, then you lose the money that you're bringing in from tariffs because no one's paying it because we're buying domestic. I don't know if all of that made sense. It made perfect sense up here. There are a lot of discrepancies in the logic behind tariffs. Also, at the end of the day, when you look at the possibility, and the Trump administration has mentioned using tariffs to somewhat replace income taxes, that also could there's just no possible way that would work. Again, when you look at income taxes, we bring in a little over $3 trillion a year in income taxes. We also, strangely enough, actually pay around $3 trillion on imports. So if we stop paying money to all of these imports because of new domestic industry, we're not going to be able to replace that unless we increase tariffs by 100%. Again, the logic of aggressively using tariffs in the 21st century in a globalized world that we help to create, I don't know where it is. It's dangerous. It actually does concern me. And again, this is neither left, right, Democrat, or Republican. It is odd. I'll leave it at that.
Well, that was very good. Uh, well, I think that was pretty comprehensive. Basically the tariffs were historically tariffs. So before the 20th century, the United States got most of its money either by the sale of public lands or by tariffs. But of course, our size of our um, population was much smaller. We were more rural. The national government was much tinier, with far fewer obligations, both to itself and to the world. The United States was not a military power, a great military power around the world. So we was a sort of a comparing the two is kind of like almost like we were almost like two separate countries uh, from the time when we actually operated with tariffs as a true income source. So I did see a couple of interesting questions about one. It was can tariffs be utilized to rectify tax cuts and generate more money? Well, there's an argument out there that it could, but the difficulty is that most economists argue that there's not enough there there wouldn't be enough coming in the tariffs, if you will, to offset um, making the tax cuts permanent and stuff like that. John had mentioned earlier on that there's a great big pile of potential money out there that's just internally that we are holding off on because of the tax cuts. Um, and to make those permanent, um, if we're just offsetting it with tariffs, you'd have to assume that we'd have a steady trade relationship to count on that money, and that's a roll of the dice, especially because if you have to think if you put a tariff on Canada, more than likely Canada puts a tariff on you. I mean that's the way it works, and that's what caused that was the argument of international economists has long been that was what caused the ongoing instabilities of the first half of the 20th century that fed the Great War and the Second World War and the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley tariff is often most infamously brought up that it deepened the depression and extended it and globalized it. There was quite a question I saw there. Why does it work for other countries charging USA high tariffs? Well, first of all, I will say this: if you look at the numbers across the time since 1945, what you'll find is that tariffs globally have declined commensurably. I mean, just across the board, they have. Um, but what I think the question might be referring to is that there have been a number of countries that have engaged in neo-mercantilist, that state kind of driven capitalism, where they utilize tariffs to protect their domestic industries and stuff. China did this stuff for years. Japan used to do it. The South Latin American countries have done it. It was particularly done by the Brazilians and the Argentinians. The South Africans did this, and the Indians have done this. So it's been done out there. But one thing, what I would say is that you're dealing with what you were dealing with most part were poorer countries who are utilizing it as a strategy, really, for what was called import substitution industrialization. They say we're not going to import cars from Europe or the United States. We're going to build our own cars so that this to stimulate our own economies. And it was a good strategy, at least in the short term. But again, in the long term, it didn't work because once they began to open their markets and had to open their markets to continue the economic growth, then they had to actually compete with the people that they used to not have to compete with, and they found out that their domestic industries were not that competitive. So um, that caused it. Fundamentally, that lie behind some of the collapse of the Japanese economy um, back a couple of decades ago now, and so on and so forth. But anyway, that's out there. Um, but there's an argument, as already been mentioned here. Well, you could utilize tariffs to help stimulate the domestic economy. You can, and to create the stronger manufacturing base and that sort of thing. You can, but you have to understand something. You got to be able to sell those products, so that's a problem. John already covered that, so we don't need to go into that. But the other thing is that there's a lag effect. It's going to take a while. It would take a while to retool industries or to develop industries, to build up that manufacturing base. Now, you could say, well, we got a lot of warehousing and stuff, and you could turn that into factories. You could, but that's going to take a while. And during that time, if you work for President Trump, what you have to hope for, because the people that get hurt the most in these kinds of things are the common working class people, because those are the people and the retired people, the people that are at the marginal stuff economically, the people that are not a part of the creative class. And so you're going to have to hope that they can live through their economic decline while you're retooling. But that's also the same people that gave you the keys to the kingdom. And the midterm election cycle is going to be next year. I mean, it's going about to start here. And the Democrats are going to be out there pounding, hey, look, remember he told you he was going to cut the price of eggs and so on and so forth. And the eggs went up, they didn't go down. Vote for the Dems. Okay, so politically, can you maintain what political scientists call your political capital during the time of your strategy of utilizing the tariffs, if that is your strategy, to stimulate domestic production? So anyway, that's just some stuff out there, but we probably need to move on. But anyway, they were very interesting questions. I like those questions.
Matt, that's a great point. I want to just hit overall. A lot of this has to do with simply the United States voluntarily taking on an extraordinarily bellicose foreign policy with the rest of the world and our allies. And that does have an impact. I mean, we have at NHL games in Canada, Canadians booing the American national anthem over voluntary aggressive tariffs on one of our absolute closest trading partners and just partners in Canada. Same with Mexico. There is a cost to the U.S. reputation globally with this bellicose approach to macroeconomics. And you nailed something there also. If these tariffs stay in place and if they grow, I guarantee, it's very rare that a political scientist will guarantee you something, especially in terms of macroeconomics in the future. But if we maintain 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 20% on China, if we maintain these aggressive tariffs, many products, the cost of living in the United States is going to dramatically increase. The Democratic Party will be able to very easily point to that was the price then, this is the price now. There was no pandemic that came in that started this. There was no foreign intervention that started this. The Trump administration started this voluntarily. I think there will be electoral costs to pay in 2026, and we'll see. Again, the general takeaway in the modern globalized world, tariffs are usually a poor decision.
Yeah, I think the only things I would reemphasize or highlight first, I think Dr. Hall correctly pointed out, right, that the issue of uncertainty, right? It's one thing if you're going to implement tariffs and you're going to say, okay, we're going to do this, and then you stick with it, right? It's another thing if you say you're going to do it, and then 30 minutes later, or an hour later, or 5 hours later, or 5 days later, you don't, because all that you can't make decisions in an environment where there's uncertainty, right? And I think that more than anything else is what, even more than the tariffs themselves is probably what's, you know, tanking the stock market, to be honest with you, right? Businesses do not like uncertainty. Regulatory uncertainty is like, you know, um, the sine qua non of a business practice, right? You want to know what rules are going to be in place and how long they're going to be in place, and preferably you don't want them to change ever, right? Because if they change, you have to change your plans, right? You have to adjust to that. And if you're all about and theoretically, right, one of the big benefits supposedly of kind of this more illiberal, authoritarian, whatever approach you want to call it, should be that there should be certainty, right? The guy in charge says we're going to do something, then he's going to stick with it, right? You don't have to worry about some other actor out there like Congress or something saying we're going to do something other than what the president wants to do, right? That's the entire quote unquote benefit of having kind of this strongman Orban type rule, right? Well, if the guy in charge is schizophrenic, not to put too fine a point on it, then or changes his mind every 15 minutes because of whatever, right? That benefit goes away, right? So now you're just flying around in the wind, right? So so pick a lane, right? I mean, I think it is part of it, right? Not again. And the other thing is, the math, right? Again, can you replace income tax with tariffs? Well, to some extent, right? You know, if there are $3 trillion in imports, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, and we need to raise $3 trillion of revenue, in theory, 100% tariff should do that, right? Now, the problem is that any economist will tell you that if you raise the price of something by 100%, unless there is an incredibly inelastic demand for that product, um, you know, um, you're not going to raise $3 trillion, right? You might raise 1 trillion or maybe half a trillion, right? How much cheap plastic crap from China do you really need to buy, right? How much do you really need to go to Dollar Tree and get stuff that's now $1.25, now going to be $2.50? How much of that garbage do you pick up at Dollar Tree for $2.50 now, 125 before, is really going to be worth it, right? At some point, you're just going to say, I don't need this, right? Or I'll go and 3D print it at home, or or maybe I'll buy it domestically and it'll cost 250, but the government won't get the extra $1.25 because I'm buying it domestically, right? If the entire point is to protect the domestic industry, then by definition, you're not going to be raising money from it, right? And you're particularly not be raising money because the workers, you're not going to give their income tax money from the money they're making from the business that's, because you got rid of the income tax, right? Um, so, I mean, it just doesn't math, right? I mean, and not to use kind of the new school terminology, but the math just doesn't work, right? So, that's the exasperating thing about this, right? I mean, not to get too animated about it, but it just like now I do think there is a good specific point to be made about specific countries, specific high tariffs, that sort of thing, and that is, yes, there are examples, and you certainly could cherry pick examples of ridiculous tariffs that are imposed by other countries on goods being
Chris, you're muted.
protection by the domestic industry, dairy industry in Canada, for example, is through the roof, right? Well, there's a way to solve that, right? Matter of fact, Donald Trump has already solved that or theoretically was going to solve that in a previous administration, right? He renegotiated NAFTA, right? He came up with a whole new trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, replaced NAFTA with this new agreement. If he really thought that that American dairy farmers were getting screwed over by Canada because of this tariff, he should have made that deal, right? He should have said, okay, well, we're renegotiating now. One of the things that should be part of this deal is, that if Wisconsin wants to sell a bunch of cheese to Ontario, then that 100% tariff has to go away, right? Did he do that? Apparently not, right? It's like he never was president before. Again, I don't want to get too on a soapbox about this, but a lot of these things, you can kind of trace back to, it's like, it's nothing, Biden did not renegotiate that again, right? This is the same deal that he negotiated with Canada and Mexico, right? So if he doesn't like it, what does that tell us about either A, his deal making ability, right? Or B, um, you know, his consistency, right? Because, you know, either way, it's not a good answer, right? What has changed between now and then? The the Canadians were not screwing us on dairy 8 years ago, but they're screwing us now under the same trade deal, right? I'm not seeing that, right? Um, and yes, if you're trying to use this as leverage for negotiations, okay, that's great, but then negotiate, right? Then say we're going to negotiate, not anyway.
I feel your pain,
On.
Chris.
We're down to our last 15 minutes, so let's talk Supreme Court. Because I know Dr. Hall really want to talk Supreme Court. See how much this we'll get through. So we've had a few. Supreme Court is currently in the process of deciding a few important cases that we've kind of picked out. One of which is called Garland versus Vanderstock. It deals with gun control and ghost guns. So, and we expect there's probably going to be a decision in that case soon, probably the next few weeks, I would imagine, since it was argued last fall. What are ghost guns? So what do we mean by ghost guns? And what might the court's ruling do about or affect ghost guns? How might it affect ghost guns?
Matt, I didn't know if I think it was your turn. If you want me to start off, you mean
I'll give it a shot here. So well, first of all, in the Garland versus Vanderstock, the Garland that we're talking about here is the former Attorney General, who was President Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who was also politically somewhat infamous. He was the individual that President Obama tried to put on the Supreme Court, and the then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, "Well, we won't deal with this. We're going to wait till after the election," and so on and so forth. Anyway, so what this really comes down to, and so before I'm going to defer mostly on these Supreme Court things to Professor John Hall, because unlike me, Professor Hall is an actual constitutional scholar. He is a public law theorist. This is his area of great speciality. But so I will keep my comments very general, so that you could get it from the subject matter expert. But what this really comes down to is, can the government, under the Gun Control Act of 1968, can it use the ATF, or Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, to regulate arms manufacturers who produce parts that are then purchased separately? These parts are not serialized, but can they be purchased separately, and then the homeowner, in a kind of do-it-yourself, puts the parts together and builds their own gun, right? So that's what's called a ghost gun, because the ghost gun it's not produced by, it's not produced by a Springfield Armory or anybody like that, or Remington or any of those outfits. It's a homemade gun. But of course, the individual, if I'm going to buy my own gun, or I'm going to make my own gun, I have to buy these parts. And so the question that is before the court is whether or not ATF, under the Gun Control Act of '68, can actually regulate, can call for regulation. There are a series of states that have passed laws at the state level that says you can or you must regulate this kind of thing for these ghost guns. So that's sort of the background to it. And so what this really comes down to is that if Professor Lawrence makes barrels, and sells them to me, Can the ATF regulate that barrel, because knowing full well that I'm going to get that barrel and I'm going to make a firearm out of it. I'm going to put it in a firearm. So is that barrel a firearm? Uh, and if it is, in certain states, it would say that he'd have to serialize it and he'd have to register it with the government so that we know where it's at and whatnot. And various other things are. Can we also do the other version of the ghost gun, which is the plastic guns? So you can build a gun that's all plastic effectively, and it'll go through any metal detector out there. So no metal in it, and until you put a round in it and then fire. But those things, you can build those things now with 3D printers. See, in the old days, I only know a small bit about this because of my other life, but in the old days, building a gun was kind of you had to get a license. You had to be a licensed armorer to build guns and stuff. That's all gone now. You can do all kinds of stuff. Anybody that's a little bit crafty can put these things together. So the real question out there, and I'm going to leave to John to discuss the legalities of this, is does the Second Amendment protect, my example here, Professor Chris's ability to create barrels that he knows full well that Matt's going to put together as an AR, his own homemade AR-15? Can the government regulate that, and can we keep account of that? Because if you could imagine that this was is a you could do a lot of bad stuff with this stuff. Anyway, I'll turn over to John on that.
Great summary there, Matt. Not a lot to actually add. You really nailed it there with the ATF and from the Gun Control Act of 1968. What the federal government does through the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, is regulate firearms. And currently, firearms licensees have to conduct background checks. They have to record their firearm transfers. They have to serialize firearms when selling or transferring guns. The ATF, the federal government, regulates the sale of guns. However, these kit guns that you described, the ghost guns, these privately made firearms, you can literally get online and put them together at your house. These ghost guns did not fit the standards that had been laid out in statutory law. So what the ATF did, they simply updated their definitions of firearms to allow for the regulation of privately made firearms or ghost guns. So at the heart of this constitutionally is, did the ATF, did this bureaucratic entity overreach its power as an agent of the executive branch by simply unilaterally redefining what guns were to include ghost guns? That's at the heart of this case. In terms of where this goes, it could go in several directions, obviously. There's one opinion that you need to know to be basically a Second Amendment case law expert, and that is DC versus Heller. And in DC versus Heller, within our lifetimes, just about 15 years ago, the federal Supreme Court was asked, and the late Justice Scalia gave his opinion. Is the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, is that an individual right, or is it predicated on military service? Because the nomenclature of the Second Amendment literally starts off by discussing a well-regulated militia. This was a debate that we had for almost a century. Then Justice Scalia in DC versus Heller gave us the definitive answer. A, the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right, not predicated on military service. And he stressed, the government can regulate that right. So is gun ownership, is the right to bear arms an individual right protected by the Constitution? Yes. Can the government regulate it? Yes. We're done. This is a matter of government regulation. Will the court identify what the ATF did and say this was an overreach and a violation of Second Amendment rights? I don't know. This one I would literally flip a coin, because it was a conservative justice, Justice Scalia, who clearly identified that while gun ownership is an individual right, government does have the right to regulate it. I would think If I had to make a guess that the court might uphold this, although the recent jurisprudence has been very much in favor of gun ownership rights, but these ghost guns create such a nightmare for law enforcement. They're not serialized. They aren't easily traced. And people who, depending on which state you're in, who are ex-felons, who by law can no longer legally own firearms, they would be able to legally own ghost guns because they would be outside of the realm of government regulation. So this would be opening up a dangerous Pandora's box if the court were to cut the legs out from underneath the ATF in their attempt to regulate ghost guns. I'm not going so far as to predict what the court would say, but I'm leaning in the direction of at least an indecisive nod toward the government that, yes, they can regulate ghost guns, but don't quote me on that.
Okay, thanks. So when hopefully we can do this one briefly. So there was a case that the court also heard late last year called U.S. versus Crometti, I believe is how you pronounce it, which is a case having to do with the rights of transgender individuals. What specific issues were raised in the case, and how might that case impact the Trump administration's efforts to roll back the Biden administration's actions on the rights of LGBTQ individuals? Dr. Hall?
This is an extraordinarily important opinion that will be coming out of the court soon. Basically, what happened, as of right now, we've got about over half of the states in the republic have issued some kind of state law limiting the healthcare providers from administering things like puberty blockers, hormone therapy, sex transition surgeries to minors. But this case actually originates specifically from Tennessee and Kentucky, a law from 2023, which literally banned exactly that, prohibiting healthcare providers from administering puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and sex transition surgeries for minors. This is something that has excessive support in Tennessee and Kentucky. However, this is a clear violation, whether it's a constitutional or unconstitutional violation, the court will tell us. But this is clearly inhibiting the transgender community, especially by definition minors, from controlling their own medical decisions. Specifically, since they're minors, there are two constitutional questions that we are looking at. First and foremost, is this a violation of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment? Meaning, do parents not have a fundamental right to make medical decisions for their children? If the states of Kentucky and Tennessee are saying absolutely no gender affirming care for minors, then what the proponents or the advocates of the transgender community are saying is that is a fundamental violation of the due process clause from the perspective of parents making decisions about their kids. Secondly, proponents or advocates of the transgender community are saying this is also a possible violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, in that it is violating the rights of transgender minors. The court is probably, based on the questions that they were asking during oral arguments, the court is clearly leaning in the direction of allowing the Tennessee and the Kentucky laws to stay. Interestingly enough, one of the conservative justices, Neil Gorsuch, was relatively quiet during oral arguments, and he authored probably one of the most important opinions in the history of transgender rights in this country when he authored a couple of years ago Bostick versus Clayton County. That was a case out of Georgia where he connected sexual orientation to sex, which is, of course, protected in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in areas of public accommodation based on race, sex, nationality, ethnicity. The court has connected sexual orientation to sex, that term, in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So which direction they'll go here constitutionally in terms of the precedent that they've already set, it looks like they would go in the direction of preventing the states from banning this. But in terms of the makeup of the court and the opinions that they were kind of letting out during oral arguments, it looks like the court is going to allow this. Anything beyond that would just be me guessing. I'm quickly racing through that because I noticed we have literally 1 minute and we are out of time. And we can continue this with any students in class if you'd like. I'll turn the floor back over.
I defer to John on these things because he knows these issues better than I do. But what it really comes down to is And so, what does the 14th Amendment mean regarding the rights of citizenship? Is citizenship a personhood identified, and he's already pointed out regarding people's lifestyles and so on and so forth. And then the other issue out there, of course, is that how deeply do rights penetrate? Do they penetrate down into the dependency world of a minor? And so obviously, you could do a lot of things as an adult that you can't do as a child. But we're talking about mental health and physical health here and stuff like that. So again, but I'm going to defer again, like I said, to defer to John on these matters because he's the subject matter expert on it.
Okay, thank you both. Yeah, I think the one thing I would just add is I don't think either of you mentioned this, but broader terms in terms of the American government courts, right? This is something we talk about in the context of the right to privacy. So I think this would be definitely a privacy rights issue, and what the extent of the right to privacy is, I think, is definitely one of the big things that's at issue in this case, as particularly as Dr. Cavley points out, the rights of minors in particular. So we are basically out of time. I apologize if we're not able to get to your questions. Hopefully at some point we can get to those in a future discussion. Speaking of future discussions, I don't have the exact dates in front of me at the moment, but we do have a couple of discussions planned for April. We're going to have a discussion about Georgia state politics in early April as we approach the end of the legislative session. So I think we've got that plan for the week that the adjournment of the legislative session is planned for on the first week of April, and then later in April. Something in my head is telling me the 24th, but I will not swear to that. Dr. Hall and Dr. Matchrock will be discussing the Russia-Ukraine war in an in-person discussion here on the Macon campus, and we'll be getting information out about those events probably after spring break. I think if we send information out now, people will just forget about it between now and then. So we'll be sending that stuff out probably in about a week and a half or so. So keep an eye out in your classes if you're a political science major in our political science information portal and on our Facebook page and things like that on X, Twitter, etc. I'd like to thank both Dr. Hall and Dr. Cavalier for their participation. I'd like to thank you all for your questions. If you have friends that were or colleagues or other people that you think might be interested in watching this or one of our previous discussions, we post them on our YouTube page, youtube.com/@MGA Paul Sci. This one will be posted probably sometime tomorrow. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to it today. So keep an eye out for that. If you're here for extra credit, your instructors will get a copy of the attendance roster. If that's how they're doing it, if they're doing a quiz or something, find out from your instructor how they will be testing you on whether or not you were paying attention. And unless we have any last minute observations from Dr. Hall or Dr. Caverly, thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll be seeing you in a few more weeks when we talk about Georgia state politics and things related to that.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, everybody. Listen, I will before I know a lot of people are going to leave, but I noticed that there was a question about application regarding vaccinations. So I'll attempt a small answer on that. I think the line would be that vaccination deals with public health, and the issue of minors' access to transgender medical procedures deals with the private sphere, and that's probably what the line would be. Although I would defer to public law theorists maybe on that, but I think that might be what's behind that. See, everybody, if you think about it this way, everybody has rights until you overly impose them on society. In other words, when you bring about chaos. So you can't holler fire in a crowded theater and stuff like that. You can say what you want until you hurt somebody or you hurt society. So like you can regulate hate speech and that kind of stuff. I think that's what the line would be drawn regarding the issue of the anti-vaxxers, uh, opposition to vaccinations, as opposed to this. Because I would agree flat out. It does open up for that debate, and so that's something that's probably an area for more um, look and inquiry. But I hope that provides a somewhat of something close to an answer anyway. Thank you.
That's a great point, Matt. And with vaccines, that's the government forcing you to do something. Whereas with transgender affirming care, that's the government not allowing you to do something also. But again, thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, if you want to put this in the context of the American government course again, one of the things that this ties into, a lot of books probably talk about this. I know my book talks about this concept of externalities, right? So, with vaccination, public health, that sort of thing, right? There is this belief in, as Dr. Cavalli kind of very succinctly put it, your rights kind of end when they extend to impacting the rights of other people, and that's where externalities come in, right? Where essentially my actions have a negative impact, or theoretically you could have a positive externality too, on another person. For example, if I have a beautiful yard, then that benefits my neighbors because the neighborhood looks nicer, right? Now, if I dump toxic waste in my backyard, that's a negative externality, because guess what? That toxic waste is going to seep into their yards and turn our entire neighborhood into a Superfund site, right? So that's where the vaccination thing comes in. If you're talking about communicable diseases, like say the measles or something like that, then there's a good case to be made that, hey, if I don't vaccinate myself or my kids, then I'm not just putting myself at risk, but I'm also creating community spread of disease and that sort of thing. Whereas with the transgender issue, again, if I get puberty blockers or whatever, or go through transition surgery, that only affects me, myself, alone. Now, there are other questions about reversibility and who should be making the decisions and that sort of thing that we could spend, oh God, probably an entire hour and 30 minutes about. So I think that there's that. And of course, Dr. Hall also made a good point about the government restricting something versus permitting it also being an issue, or requiring it, right? Those are, requiring something versus permitting something versus saying you shouldn't do something versus it saying you can't do something, right? That's four different things, right? And the government, when it comes to legal arguments, there's a legal distinction between those four, right? And probably more gradations in between, right? Can the government subsidize it, right? That's probably a fifth one, right? Can the government tax you for not doing it? That's a sixth one, right? Can it discourage it? So anyway, but thank you all again. We have gone long. I will include this in the recording because people had questions about it, or it was an important, interesting question. But thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you soon. And have a good evening and a good rest of your week and a good spring break.
Thank y'all. See you, Matt. See you, Chris.
See ya.
Bye all.